Thank you, Rebecca. It's hard to clip that thing so it doesn't rub against the wool, so it isn't like a terrible white noise. Did you take away some of my talk? Well, it would have been a little shorter. You would have been a little confused. So thanks so much for the warm welcome, and I'm so excited to be here to talk to the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society. I've been to your talks before, and they're always lovely, and I'm continually thrilled to be in this province generally, and love to share my research with the actual people who are related to it. So on the 5th of September, 1863, it was a typical day in the store of the Ryan merchant premises in Bonavista, Newfoundland. Among the purchases of flour and molasses and even rum from the premises tavern, several goods were bought that were either ready-made garments or mass-produced garment-making components. Mary Doyle got some worsted hose for herself at 2 shillings 9 pence, and a Mrs. Way bought a pair of high shoes on Mary Doyle's account as well. James Powell purchased 3.5 yards of regatta and some thread for 5 shillings 1 pence. And Patrick Hemming also bought about a shilling's worth of thread, and this would have been about a whole bobbin or about 4 knots, which would be on 4 slips of paper. While Lance Hemming's wife purchased the same value of yarn, usually in what's called a hank at this time, and what we would today call a skein. This mixture of notions and more long-standing ready-made goods like hosiery and footwear is typical for 1863, the first year of the journal records held at Memorial University, at the MHA, or the Maritime History Archives, and by all account, this was a difficult one for Bonavistans, both reflected in studies of the fishery in the 1860s and in the community's consumption rate of clothing. So the papers that form the basis of this research are daily journals from the store at the Ryan premises. These large bound volumes record a range of useful historical data on the everyday Bonavistans and others from around both Bonavista Bay and Northwest Trinity Bay. And these papers are held, like I said, at the MHA here at MUN, an institution which many of you no doubt are familiar with due to its vast holdings of Newfoundland maritime records, in addition to its main world-class collection of British labor contracts called crew agreements. And these records have long driven my research. They're where I cut my teeth as an undergrad, writing first about the autobiography of the Newfoundland ship captain William Morris Barnes, tracing his career through those labor records. And I followed this up by pursuing my fascination with the inventories of clothing, possessions, and wages that I noticed in the crew agreement logbooks from when seafarers died at sea, which was unfortunately fairly frequent. And I took that experience with British government records to my doctoral project, looking at how the Navy contracted for mass-produced maritime menswear or slops for the use of ratings during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. So for this project, I am interested in marrying the growth of that military ready-made market from the early 19th century with the consumption of civilian maritime workers in this later period. And for this, I turned to the abundance of records at the MHA and specifically on those in the Ryan Fonds to look at the consuming habits of Newfoundland fishers. So why then Newfoundland for this project, and why Bonavista? It's very refreshing to not have to describe where Newfoundland is to this audience and not Bonavista. But as you all well know, Newfoundland is a British colony of primarily maritime workers that was an important fishery and military outpost at this time, central to the trade in salt cod with Europe and the Americas. And while there is somewhat of a unique dress culture, I suspected that Newfoundlanders still insisted on clothing that was relatively related to the clothes that maritime workers in Britain were wearing, and that that clothing would reveal the garments that worked well at sea or in equally harsh coastal climates. And I was equally interested in returning to the records of those deep sea seafarers I mentioned in the crew agreements at the MHA, and was interested in comparing them to a landward population as both a comparison to workers whose deaths created inventories of men distant from home, and to see if store records would add to my understanding of the kind of fabrics and colors and consumptive preferences that maritime workers preferred, but are completely hidden in those crew agreement inventories, which are so fascinating but frustratingly vague. And finally, the clothing, or this collection of merchant records, particularly the Ryan Fawns, are so robust here at the MHA. And so this was my choice of Bonavista specifically. It would allow me to work with a collection that was concurrent with the crew agreements in the same 2 decades of 1860 and 1880, when the crew agreements inventories are particularly robust. So the journals were recorded daily transactions conducted between the Ryans and their clients, employees, and sometimes their suppliers. And these are extracted after the fact from daily entry books maintained at the firm's harbor premises, and include a wealth of data about what Bonavistans needed for their everyday lives and their work. So this page here is just a snapshot 2 days of purchases in September. The bulk of these purchases are for either fishery supplies, shipbuilding and maintenance, and products for domestic households. And this final category includes foodstuffs, both preserved and fresh, house goods like furniture and dishes, and notions, and of course, clothing and clothing components. So the Ryan stocked a variety of apparel, fabric, and notions, and these products ranged in price and quality, though, of course, hardy, warm, and cheap fabrics were preferred. And the Ryans also sold a variety of ready-made goods, divided into what I call established ready-made goods and new ready-made goods, which is a distinction I'll talk about later. So until the financial crash in the early 1890s, all the Ryan records were recorded in British pound sterling, which you can see here that there's 3 columns built into the record books to account for that. So even after the colony of Newfoundland adopted their own dollar currency in the 1860s, until the crash, they stayed with British pounds. So the records give the full names of the clients of the store and indicate where the purchases were recorded against their credit accounts and other Ryan documents. And they indicate when people from other communities nearby visited the store, recording purchases from around the tip of the Bonavista Peninsula, as well as including infrequent purchases from further abroad. The records mention renamed communities like Elliston, Maberley, and Dontera, which were formerly Bird Island Cove, Muddy Brook, and Broad Cove, as well as parts of the town of Bonavista, which were still demarcated as if they were separate communities, so Canale and Bailey's Cove. In 1863, the Ryan store attracted mostly Bonavistan locals and those from coves nearby, no further than Broad Cove, and none from Trinity Bay. But by 1873, the instances of people making purchases from communities abroad grew and included some atypically large entries from Gambo and Greens Pond, suggesting that Ryans were occasionally supplying other merchants in those communities, or at least store owners in those communities, on an emergency basis, perhaps, because this is extremely rare. So over the decades, the record keepers changed. And the information they recorded as well as their script also changed. In 1863, for example, the clerk had a large, slanted a messy hand and included both the account against which the purchase was charged, as well as who was actually in the store purchasing the goods. So a little good, a little bad, extremely hard to read, but has this added extra detail. And what this reveals is the consumption activity of women in the store, with many accounts being held by men. By adding who's actually purchasing the goods, you can see when wives, mothers, daughters, even servants, or women with named or unnamed connections entered the store and may purchase against someone else's account, which is really interesting. By contrast, in 1873 and 83, this per consumer edition was abandoned, and women nearly disappear from the Ryan Journal for those years, excepting a small portion of women who had accounts in their own name. And that would be about like a 10% of the population, I would say, no higher probably. The writing in 73 and 83 also both changed to a neater, still slightly slanted right hand. Though the different strokes, there are clues in the strokes that suggest these are different clerks. You can see the actually how I think I can tell is the pound sign here. The 73 L's are extremely loose and broad, and the lib in like 1 pound of tea is really tight and narrow. But it could just be that it's been 10 years and the handwriting has changed. So, but what is interesting is that by 83, they start to initial the pages of the journal, which you can see up here in the corner. And the MHA has a series of 4 photographs of the clerks at work for the Ryans during this time, circa 1880s. And the initials do seem to match Joseph Pike, who's in the larger photograph, though the lack of information about these men make this difficult to determine. So for the other 3 men, there's no first names attached to these photographs. And for the first man in the more faded photograph, there's no name recorded with him. So he could be like John Price, and that would just throw a wrench in my suppositions, I guess. So this is entirely speculation by me, but kind of interesting. Finally, all 3 years try to differentiate between similarly named accounts. Account holders by indicating their patrilineal or more rarely their matrilineal relationships. So someone like John Fifield was written as John Fifield of James, or Sampson Abbott as Sampson Abbott of Deborah, for example. And this female matrilineal thing only happens like 2 or 3 times. So it's kind of interesting. It would be interesting to know why, whether she was widowed and ran the account, or for what other reason that might have happened. So for this study, I built a database in Excel where I extracted the clothing purchases from the journal. And this process is, of course, somewhat subjective. For the most part, it's pretty easy to identify what's a garment or notion. Most of the time, I just go down the list and look for the word yard before I start writing something down. But, and especially with that first guy, because his handwriting's so bad. But but there are some crossover. So for example, canvas was commonly used to make robust jackets and trousers for maritime men. And this is reflected in many forms in the Dictionary of Newfoundland English collection at Munfla that describe Newfoundlanders at sea dressed in this way, either in linseed treated oilclothes or in raw canvas garments. But of course, the reason that fishers and sailors used canvas wasn't just because it wore hard and was watertight, but because it was around. They had access to sail canvas. So it's sometimes impossible for me to know if what they're purchasing is intended to be made into sails or if it's intended for garments. Although there is sail that is literally sail canvas, and they just write it out, and you're just like, great, thanks. 10 out of 10, helpful. But of course, the reason, and so the other really difficult place is shoemaking components, which could be used for a variety of things. So of course, leather begins to have cobbling adjectives added by 1873, but most leather has no hint of its intended purpose. So you can see with the lower example that the two leathers are distinguished. One is uppers and one is sole. So they're intended for different parts of a shoe. But the upper example just has like a 1/4 pound of leather. So it's like, what's it for? Who knows? And that's the more common designation for leather. And further, the nails used to attach the sole to the upper or to add cleats to the bottom of a men's shoe were known locally here as sparables. And this term is shared by the nails used to shoe horses. And I do actually think that any nails being made for the purpose of shoeing horses probably were made in a blacksmith shop for purpose by the smith. But again, it's impossible to know. And but kind of an interesting aside is that you can see the word here that's highlighted, but it's not actually sparable, it's sparrow bill, like the beak of a bird. And it's because in 63 and 73, whoever is clerking refers to them as sparrow bills, which is, I think, a British colloquialism for the same nail. But it's a linguistic quirk that doesn't seem to have crossed over into Newfoundland parlance and only appears in these, I mean, I don't know if it only appears, but appears in these journals. But when I looked it up in the Newfoundland dictionary, it doesn't appear in any of the forms except as an aside. So that's kind of interesting. So this is what it looks like. Yeah. When entering this data into the sheet, I record everything in conjunction with the information from the journal reference, the date, the account name, and the item's value. And I use an Excel function to force the 3 columns of pounds, shillings, and pence to convert into decimals that can be read by a computer. Computers really hate numbers that have 2 decimal points. And in fact, don't recognize them as numbers. So that's helpful. And through this, I can quantify the value of the quantity purchased. So I can divide the final cost by the quantity of the purchased item. And the reason I do this is, one, it's just a really interesting thing to know, part of the quantification. But the other reason is that sometimes they do write it down in the ledger, and it allows me to verify that my data entry is correct as I go along. And again, with the first guy, sometimes you don't know what he wrote. So it was important to be able to figure that out. So through this data set, I'm hoping to understand how both the presence and absence of products in the Ryan store reveal both what Bonavistans were wearing as they bought into an Atlantic consumer culture, but also what was still being produced in the home as both unpaid domestic work and as paid work by domestic staff or local seamstresses, along with what garments male workers like cobblers and tanners, and even men familiar with sewing from working with sail canvas and fishing nets would be producing. So let's talk about what we're seeing in the records. And I really have to apologize because there's so little extant clothes that you're going to be looking at a lot of graphs instead. But there will be pictures eventually. So what I see is a really careful and thoughtful consumption of largely component goods, so fabric, thread, and tools for garment making. And the majority of fabrics purchased were hardy, warm, cheap, usually a combination of these qualities. Flannel and wincey, for example, were durable fabrics with a soft nap used for underwear or shirts, with flannel being made of wool and wincey of cotton or of a mixture of wool and cotton. And obviously, we still see flannel quite a bit. It's made the jump to modern apparel. Swanskin, on the other hand, is kind of a lesser known fabric. It's a woolen with a soft nap on one side that resembles down feathers. That's how it gets the name swanskin. So it looks like swan down. And it's extremely significant for Newfoundland. It was originally milled in the West Country, and it's likely how it made the jump from the West Country to here through workers in the West Country fishery. Tweed and coating were used for outerwear, especially men's coats, with moleskin and homespun preferred for trousers. And calico here, I believe, refers to bleached cotton cloth, as the journals also list a blay calico, and blay is an Irish word for unbleached. So again, some more specific fabric language moving from Britain to Newfoundland. And in the Newfoundland dictionary, it loses its fabric connotations and starts to mean brown, the color brown. But so that suggests that the blay calico is unbleached calico. So calico must be bleached. And, and it seems like I'm really trying to figure out something really specific and weird, but that's because, as ever, this is consistent with the British meaning of calico, but in the United States, calico means the opposite. It means a print fabric. Yeah, see, she knows. And so during this period, and this is often how it goes. You'll read a definition of a fabric in the dictionary, and you'll be like, well, in Britain it meant this, but in the United States it meant that. And you're just like, and what did it mean in Newfoundland? Who knows? On the topic of cottons, white cotton specifically, so calico, was increasingly replacing linen as the preferred fabric for undergarments, like petticoats, shirts, shirtlets, corset covers, and other garments, with printed cottons being reserved for women's dresses and skirts and the like. The reason that this is significant is that previously the preferred fabric would have been linen, which used to have really important associations with personal hygiene as well as wider understandings of European health. But this period, the pricing of cotton is just becoming so competitive with linen that people are actually switching over and abandoning linen as a underwear cloth, which is really changes. And there's a lot of big, in the 19th century, a lot of big fabric changes happening in the market. Particularly surrounding linen and removing linen from mixed fabrics and adding cotton, which makes everything cheaper. And Bonavistans are benefiting from these changes. So finally, another really interesting and popular fabric here is Coburg, and that's a cotton and wool twill stuff that was a cashmere imitation. So what it's doing is imitating a nicer fabric. And why this is significant is that the fabric was then frequently used for funerals. And the Ryan journals support this. It's frequently purchased in the color black and does make large quantity appearances every once in a while. So it'd be kind of interesting to follow and see if it is related to funerals occurring in the community. So these ready-made goods then fall into two categories, which I kind of already mentioned. So established ready-made and sort of new market ready-made. And by this I mean, by established products, I mean items that required specialist labor, like shoes that were never really made in a household, but either had cobblers, and obviously there's this distinction between cobblers in the town of Bonavista, which their shoes probably weren't appearing in the Ryan store, and then cobblers and shoe manufacturers working in St. John's, and actual imports from Britain and the United States. And it's kind of impossible to know which one is which of those two categories in these records, but there's sometimes some distinction of English shoes, but it's hard to know again whether it's the leather that's English or the shoe. Another established ready-made clothes would be small items, so cheap accessories, where you could rationalize the expense of purchasing a ready-made object. So handkerchiefs, hats and caps, gloves, ties and collars. These are things that you could make at home, but they're kind of not worth your time. And products that have a long history of mechanization, and the primary example of that is hosiery. Stockings and hose have been produced on knitting frames since the 16th century. So purchasing ready-made hose would have been fairly normal. And it's the most popular ready-made object other than shoes purchased in Bonavista. And obviously people were knitting socks and stockings in Bonavista, there's no doubt. But this would be a type of like very finely knit, almost impossible to imitate for a human hosiery that would be soft and not itchy, and probably serve as a layer between your wool sock and your actual skin. So then new ready-made is basically this new market of ready-made clothes. So trousers, shirts, waistcoats, coats, and for some people in the world, women's dresses, blouses, and skirts. But none of that is appearing in Bonavista, only men's ready-made. So for the most part, garments are being made at home, but Bonavistans did use ready-made to supplement men's wardrobes. The purchase of ready-made clothes in 1863 and 73 spiked right before the fishing season starts in the spring, and the consumption of clothing goods from the store drops during the fishery when women were out on the flakes and had less time to dedicate to garment making. And you can see that the blue column is ready-made. So you can see the blue spiking along with everything else. And particularly June, the June column goes up, so they're buying ready-made even as they're not buying as much fabric, which I think is kind of interesting. And the green fleck is when Ryan's put out a sealing voyage. And so you get all the buys going in and buying some goggles to go out to sea, to go out on the ice. So that was really interesting to see show up. So what's not being purchased? From the description of Newfoundlanders by observers and in their own words and through the conspicuous absences in these records, we can deduce what is being locally produced and made in the home, either because it was too costly to pay for or because they were unique goods to Newfoundland and therefore weren't being imported. So for example, drawers and almost all forms of underwear, excepting corsetry and hosiery, were entirely absent from the records. So it's probable that women were knitting drawers or sewing flannel into drawers themselves, though mass-produced knit drawers existed in Britain by 1810, and eventually Canadian products like Stanfield's underwear do reach Newfoundland. So that's Stanfield at the Rooms. My mom's from Truro, so I had to get the Stanfield's reference in, right? Knitwear goods generally don't show up in the store, so it's pretty clear that knitting is happening at home. Although guernseys and mittens do occasionally appear, but it's kind of funny that who's buying them is actually the Ryans from their own store. So I just feel like no one likes them enough to make them a guernsey. You can be the richest man in Newfoundland and no one will make you a sweater, right? And of course, yarn itself is ubiquitous. It's all through these records. So they're clearly supplementing any local yarn production with imported yarn from abroad. So garments requiring knitting were seemingly all made at home. And another good, and I already mentioned swan skin, is specialist goods that were made of swan skin. And swan skin is purchased in a really interesting way, which is that it's almost never sold in large yardages. It's almost always sold in fractions of yards, very small portions. And that's largely because what's being made with it is swan skin mittens, also called cuffs, which are used to protect the hands from cold water and wood while rowing at sea. So this is an image in the middle of a pair of swanskin cuffs that are up in Change Islands. Very rare survival. The county that makes this fabric in England says that they don't even have a single example of this fabric anymore. When they discovered these mittens, they were like ecstatic. And also, the other thing they're making with swanskin are called buskins, a kind of Newfoundland spat that were strapped over the tops of boots to keep snow and wet out. And buskins could be made out of canvas or they could be knit. And they were particularly associated with a popular low boot called bluchers. And this is the history of every boot needing to be named after somebody from the Battle of Waterloo. And Napoleons were very popular in Bonavista, so you can take from that what you want. Adding fabric so by adding fabric to extend the height of shoes or low boots was very common. And it's something I used to see in government contracting during the Napoleonic Wars for the Marine uniforms. And they would just add a black spat, and it would look like you had boots on, but it was just cloth, and they wouldn't have to pay for leather. Anyway, so it's clear that that's probably a little bit of what's happening with the buskins. It's both like to keep the snow out, very practical, deep snow. A lot of times it's described on Newfoundlanders going out to cut wood in the winter, but also it's helping your personal finances get stretched a little farther. So where's all this clothes coming from? Access to ready-made clothing and component goods in Bonavista was limited by distance and expense. Most consumer products were imported into the colony, and the rates of local clothing production were initially low and remained tied to the fate of Newfoundland's political and economic status. Prior to the 1860s, the cod and seal fisheries accounted for 95% of Newfoundland's exports and employed 90% of the island's population. But Canada's push for confederation, failed push, and the buckling of the cod stocks in the 1860s kicked some diversification into gear. So with this new industrial nativism and Newfoundland nationalism in the late 19th century, several garment factories were built in St. John's and around the Avalon, such as the Boot and Shoe Factory and the Newfoundland Clothing Company. In addition, local specialists existed in St. John's and Bonavista. I've seen ads for example, oil clothes manufacturers around the city. And obviously the most famous shoe producer would be Joey Smallwood's grandfather David and his uncle Frank, who both ran versions of Smallwood boots in the 1880s and into the 20th century, producing such provocative footwear ads as this one in the Evening Telegram, declaring, "Friends, consider your feet." Just something I do, I guess. You can buy a pair of 3/4 boots anytime, but you can't buy a new pair of feet. And I mean, he's clearly related to Joey Smallwood. And then you have tailor shops like Munder's that's pictured here that produce garments based on fashion plates and catalog illustrations. So this is really great that it's apparent in this photograph. This is the one obviously used to advertise the talk, but you can see on the wall surrounded by one of the yellow circles, are fashion plates, and they're imitating the clothes in the fashion plates. So you don't actually have to buy clothes and import them from London. If you get the images from London, you can have them in your store and produce fashionable garments for your local clientele just by copying. You have to invent what's on the back, though. No, they did turn the pictures around. And interestingly, there's catalogs. So the Ryan's premises would have had catalogs like this, and probably local women would have done the same thing with those catalogs. Come in and look through the catalogs and made clothing with fashionable accoutrements, but without buying something from Paris, obviously. And in a 1911 advertisement, or by 1890, there were 4 partnership clothiers in St. John's and 8 large sole trading businesses, with many of these firms starting with fishing merchants as silent financial partners. And there's big anxiety in the papers at this time about how much fishing money is going into these new businesses, because obviously the point of diversifying the economy is to not have more fishing money in all your domestic production. But it's clear that that this stuff all needed financial help, and the only financial help was fishing merchants. In 1911, the Evening Herald article about the new Newfoundland clothing company factory built on Duckworth Street remarked that there were significant Newfoundland tariffs that complicated the clothing industry in the colony, with a 45% tariff on ready-mades and 25 to 35% on raw materials for garment production, in addition to the cost of labor. Therefore, regardless of whether ready-made clothing was coming from St. John's or from abroad, the garments were already significantly marked up in price by the time they arrived in an outport like Bonavista. So what these records reveal is the high cost of ready-made kept production of clothing tied to women's domestic labor. Men's ready-made clothing in small supplementary purchases was the exception, and allowed for some leeway in women's work in communities like Bonavista. Men's clothing rather than women's was purchased ready-made because it was often technically more difficult to produce, because men's maritime labor required well-made, watertight clothing, and was also prioritized over women's work, and also because young men, often itinerant, could lose access to cheap in-home garment production formerly done by mothers and sisters and wives and daughters, and might actually have to buy ready-made clothes because they had no other option. This is why Bonavista is such an important contrast to the deep-sea seafarers inventories I previously worked with. However, while remaining a maritime workforce, the men of Bonavista did not by and large lose access to this industrious clothing production of women and girls, and indeed this was the foremost source of clothing in Bonavista. Ready-made menswear remained expensive and supplementary throughout this period, and women's clothing was entirely produced within the home. These journals reveal the labor of women garment makers whose work in Bonavista was largely unpaid, and the journals suggest that one or two women did maybe become seamstresses, like Anne Tuff and Joanna White in 1863, or Anne Coates and Ellen Abbott in 1873, or Lydia Dirtle and Deborah Sharp in 1883. And I don't know, these are just suppositions, but they bought a lot of fabric. Women did their best to dress well. They purchased flashy fabrics like the magenta dress stuff that I saw in 1863, and also corsets, bonnet crepe, and silk flowers to join the hardy fabrics and stout leather boots of everyday fashion in Bonavista. So in 1929, Bartlett described the clothing of the men who arrived to prosecute the seal fishery in terms that sound very familiar to me, dealing with people who were buying clothes in the 1860s and 70s, unfortunately. He says they wear canvas jumpers over homemade guernseys, moleskin or homespun trousers, 1 or 4 red or white flannel shirts, and home knit heavy drawers. Some wear sealskin caps, some Elsinores or whalers, which are leather wool lined caps with ear flaps. Their mittens are also homemade. Some have tan sealskin boots with soles of leather. Others wear 3/4 boots, maybe bought from Joey Smallwood's uncle. And other buskins, low bluchers with wool stockings pulled over. Along with descriptions like these taken across a wide range of time, some of which are from outsiders remarking on unique aspects of Newfoundland clothing like cuffs and buskins, the Ryan journals allow a view of what Outport Newfoundlanders had access to in local stores and what they were buying. Despite Newfoundland holding so few extant garments and the clothing of working men and women from communities like Bonavista in particular being fugitive. In museum and personal collections, therefore, these records, like the wider crew agreement collection here at MUN, become an alternate means to understand and recreate the clothing worn by persons whose garments were not considered worth saving, or whose use transcended clothing, becoming rugs, patches, rags, and stuffing. But also, the journals themselves are historical objects. The books were mass-produced for their particular purpose and were also covered in book muslin, which was lovingly sewn into place for extra protection. And then the cloth was carefully decorated in black and sometimes red ink with elaborate designs in the cover and spine, stating the year and use. The journals record the purchase of this fabric for other people's accounting books in Bonavista, like the 3 yards Patrick Fennell purchased in January 27, 1883 for 3 shillings. In this way, the journals are both physical evidence and written record of their own purchase, their own significance, and their own intended longevity, and have found, unlike the clothes that have disappeared into hooked rugs and rag bins, a lasting home here at MUN at the Maritime History Archive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for giving us this talk and sharing your research of the past few years. We've certainly got, I think, a good little bit of time that we can take some questions. So I'm going to start with some of the audience here, and I'm also going to turn to our technician and invite any of those who are joining us online to submit your questions in the chat, and we'll get to everybody, as I'm sure we've all got things to ask Megan. John, go ahead and get us started.
Remember, you have to, for the benefit of the online. What I first noticed about your work was that you have tackled the actual account books, the journals, and a lot of economic historians usually often limit themselves to the census material, the letter books, and other things. And so it's really great to see that you've tackled the actual documents, because a lot of it can be intimidating. And I think I mentioned in the email to you another great example of this is the work that John Mannion just published about Waterford's maritime world, which he built around a ledger from 1750 to 1757, I believe. Anyway, I guess you'll have to explain, give a summary of my comments.
Yeah, was it John Mannion's Waterford, Wider Waterford World, or Waterford's Maritime World? Yeah, and this is largely, I think, one of the great benefits that we're offered here at MUN as students, which is to be able to go into an actual archive as young people and be told and shown what the benefits of actually sitting in an archive and dealing with the history of documents is, and it's caused me to think a lot about how my sources get to even to a collection. when I was writing my dissertation, somebody magically, sometimes they just know when you want them to publish an article about the naval postage system and so how letters that captains were writing would get back to Britain, which were what I was using. I was using complaints about clothes to write about clothing in the Navy. And so he worked out all these timelines and things, and it was just like the mechanics of it all were just like fantastic. But with the crew agreements also, because they're not supposed to be here technically, they're supposed to be in England, we do spend a lot of time having to explain to students and to researchers why they're here in Newfoundland and not in a building next to the Tower of London and down like in the metropolitan city. So yeah, I think a lot about that. And that's, yeah, like I said, one of the great benefits of studying here is having an access to such a great resource and such great archivists. I have a lot to thank to Dave Bradley and everyone at the MHA and Heather Wareham before him. Do I notice any difference between the clothes for attracting mates, so purchased by young people, and those purchased by old? I don't. There's no real indication of age in the ledgers except when somebody names their son after themselves. So I get the occasional so-and-so junior and so-and-so senior. Sometimes there's only a junior though, and he's maybe, in his 40s. And so yeah, so in some ways the data that they give me is really interesting and helps a bit with trying to parse out like these familiar relationships and like what people are doing. But in other ways, there's nothing more than what they give me. So I can guess sometimes women come in and buy some colorful fabric, and you see hat crepe and silk flowers and things. So you expect that they're sort of dressing to go out and have a nice Sunday dress or whatever. But yeah, that's as far as you can guess on that front. And I would have to probably do like a pretty advanced genealogical survey of Bonavista, pairing names with actual people, which could be done, and it's not really my interest, but there's certainly loads of stuff you can do with these records. And I'm only looking at the clothing parts of it too, because there's a ton of fisheries stuff, shipbuilding information, food. The food stuff is fascinating.
Got one from the chat here. I want to
Sure.
share. And I'll steal the mic so I think that everyone can hear me. So Terry Kissy has asked in the chat that you've noted and noted in your presentation a number of interesting and very exceedingly large purchases, particularly from Greenspond. I was wondering if you could comment on any of the people or particularly about those purchases or relate it to Greenspond.
Greenspond, I can't remember what it is. I know that they've purchased a few times and that they're usually pretty significant purchases, which you kind of would expect considering that they would have to sail that all home. But because the one that I really remember is the Gambo purchase, which was like up to like between 75 and 100 yards of fabric in each type of fabric. It was like a huge purchase. And that's why I kind of speculated that it might be to supply a store or some other merchant that was hoping to resell in another community. But I do think that the Greenspond purchases were just as big. And if I talked a bit about my data set and pretended like it was perfect and beautiful, but one of the things I do have to go through is to parse where everybody's from actually. So if I had done my job I could have sat here and just been like, oh, let me look that up, but I didn't, so I can't just uh, go in and pull out the green spawn stuff. I think there were 2 questions. All right. Mm.
Maybe something. Notify the source and provide identity.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, no, that was something I was actually I was thinking about doing because there's so few women that purchase that way, especially in 63. So the Ann Tuff and Joanna White, and because they're collaborating, they're going in and buying because I could see their account, like who's coming in and charging the account. They're coming in and buying on each other's accounts occasionally. But both women are not in the 73, and that's either because they've gotten married and are now Mrs. So-and-so, or the accounts or they're buying under a man's name in their account, or perhaps they moved to St. John's and work professionally as seamstresses, or left the community to do more lucrative work somewhere else in the province, or even in New England or Montreal. So, so it would be interesting for those 2 women in specific because that's so particular. That would be the 1873. So yeah. So 10% of the 10%, so more details about the 10% number I gave on the women holding their own accounts in 1873. So again, if I had done my job properly, I would have gone through and quantified whether the account holder was male or female, and then I could just actually get a percentage and be like a real quantitative historian. But I am a fake quantitative historian. I am a cultural historian masquerading as a quantitative historian. Yeah, exactly, right? So that's like my gut feeling. I would say between 5 and 15%, like, and like, because the first time when I was first thinking about it, I was like, there were no women, and I've since gone through and been like, there's a lot of women here. So my brain is so that 10% number is Megan's feels percent, not an actual real data number. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I went to look for this example because I do remember it, and I wanted to put it up on the thing, but there was a woman. It was like Mrs. So and So and Sons, as if it was like a actual merchant account, or a planter account, and it's suggesting that maybe the husband had died and and the boys maybe weren't old enough. Like they were clearly old enough to fish, but maybe not old enough to take charge of the finances, and that she was running the finances. But I couldn't find it, so maybe I dreamed it into existence. I don't know, but or it might be a different year I saw it and imagined it was 73. But yeah, so there's lots of interesting stuff. Yeah, different like interesting relationships and quirks that come up. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, right. Mm, mm. Mhm. Yeah, no one ever wants to be the person whose relative says the bad handwriting. But dealing with ship captain's records before this, you could get some rough ones. But then I moved to the Navy, and bless the Navy, they all had hired clerks for miles, like professional scribes. I was sitting next to people in the National Archives who had like books from like 1970, and it was just like a heart rate flatline monitor, and they were like crying, and I'm like, "Oh, my 200-year-old documents look great." But for your question, which is what type of books these were, the Ryan fawns are very large, and I am familiar with the Trinity books, and Dave and I did discuss whether I would move off in that direction. And in fact, I should reveal that I was supposed to go to 1913, which is extremely ambitious as one person entering all this data myself, because I'm barely through 1883. And so what will probably happen if I want to go back and try to deal with these is actually to go back in time and try to break up the 10-year gaps instead of go forward, because they double and triple in size every year, and I can't do that by myself. So these journals are just the extracted records from the store. They're not the records that would have been taken as people purchased the goods in the store themselves. They're actually like a record made later, which is kind of interesting, and I have to ask Dave more about that. But also they're not, there's also further accounts for like the fishing records that are also separate from these, although some fishing records do end up in these. Largely what the Ryans, yeah, and I ignore them because they're not close. That's the answer to that. Like, I know I've seen whitefish in there, but I'm like, nah, I just skip over it. My eyes go out of focus and I scroll down the page.
Also, Grant,
Oh,
we might be able to
yeah. So talking about, again, the books and about the clerks. So I know of now 5 clerks, and I should also reveal that I just found those pictures from the MHA like 3 days ago, and was like so excited and really cuffed that the JP matched with the Joseph Pike. So of course I haven't looked into it. That's largely why I can't confirm that it's actually him. But the actual pictures themselves on the MHA don't have any more information. It seems like one of the people, the family that donated the pictures, seems to either have been somebody else who worked for the Ryans and then had all the pictures for some reason. They're all taken in different places. Some of them were taken in Montreal, and different photography studios. And it seems like somebody just came into possession of these and then donated them to the MHA, someone with Ryan Associations also. But the 5th clerk I know of is Robert Brown, and the reason I know about him is that he charges things to the store. And then I get office in brackets. So Robert Brown seems to be a longstanding clerk. He was there in 73. He's still there in 83. And I know from looking into it in the Ryan diaries, like James Ryan's personal diaries, that he records when Brown passes away in the early 20th century. So he appears to spend the rest of his life there. And I initially assumed that he was the clerk who was doing all this record keeping. And that was somewhat substantiated by some of the weird lingo, because this messy clerk from 63 also refers to pants as trousers. And then in 73, it switches to pants and never again goes back to trousers. So, and Brown is from Scotland. So I thought maybe he was bringing some of that, some English terminology to the records. Because by this point, this is a calico issue, right? Except the opposite. It's the same thing with two different names, and knowing whether Newfoundlanders referred to trousers as trousers or pants is again. But but the first thing I did when I saw those pictures was look their names up in the Ryan diaries as well. And I mean, Ryan wasn't really writing about his staff in those books. He's more interested in like the coming and goings of sealing ships and other things. So they don't show up at all, none of the names. So I don't know of anything more about these men. They're just sort of ghosts that continue to spell Dungaree, Dongaree. Thanks. Yeah, so you're asking if I've seen any anomalies or weird purchases, and the answer to that is yes. And sometimes things are weird for two reasons, and they're kind of like, why are they like? Did they stock these? Did they order them? Did they bring them in and then have them on the shelf, and then one person came in and bought it? And so Rebecca will remember this day because one day somebody bought a Jew harp. And I had to look up what that was. And we together, Rebecca and I, because we shared an office, were like reading this article about the history of Jew harps. And I can't even remember what they were now. There's some sort of mouth, yeah, they're a little mouth instrument. And then I turned the page and they returned it. What? And returns are very rare. So the fact that they went back to the store and was just like, I want my money back from this. I played this for one day and I'm done. But it does maybe suggest that maybe a child went in and bought it on their parents' account or something, and they went home and annoyed their mother for like 3 hours, and it got taken away and promptly returned the next day, which I think is uh, a story that probably many of us have lived. And some stuff is just, I had some yards of waterproofs that were purchased in 63, and that sent me down a rabbit hole of figuring out whether rubber was vulcanized at the time and like what waterproof would be and whether it was Macintosh, and it was related to like early fabric used in raincoats. So it was kind of interesting that it turned up in Bonavista, but I can't remember who bought it, and it was probably the Ryans because it was very expensive. And sometimes it's really interesting what doesn't, like I said, what doesn't get purchased. So in 63, there's no coats, men's coats purchased the whole year, which is kind of indicative of how hard the year was. Because coats could cost more than shoes and were equivalent to like a barrel of flour. So like your like living commodities, your basics. So it's clear that they were buying fabric intended for coats, and that was probably going towards patching and make do work. But the actual buying a ready-made coat just isn't a thing for that whole year. And then you have to ask, did the Ryans even import them? So, I mean, that's the thing. All this is like, you stare not long enough at the data set and the data set stares back, right? Sure. The question is, what do I know about the factories in St. John's? And I would recommend an excellent MA dissertation written by our own John Joy, who I found very early in my study and was like, great, I don't have to look up all this stuff about St. John's so I can write a study on Bonavista. But the answer is there's both. So there's small, businesses like Munders who would, and actually in the Munders photo, the woman there is described as a tailoress, not as a seamstress. So she's got like a extended professional title. And then you do have the factories that are employing people as factory workers. So so for example, the clothing company, Newfoundland Clothing Company building was this large factory floor that was on Duckworth Street apparently. So when I say large, you have to imagine that it would fit on Duckworth Street somewhere, but would have been probably had a cutting room on the top floor and then sewing rooms below. And the reason the cutting room would be on the top is so that they would have the light for the natural light to light up the tables while they were cutting the fabric, which would be the most expensive part and the most skilled part of the process. And there are photos of the inside of these kind of factories, not the Newfoundland one, but other factories. So you can sort of see how they would have functioned, but they would have been pretty crowded. And they do talk about how many people are hired by the different factories, and I can't remember what those numbers are right now, but it's pretty significant. And the New Colonist newspaper is really excited about these companies because they're anti-Confederation paper, so they're really interested in any projects that will keep the province self-sustaining or the colony self-sustaining and out of Confederation. But of course, one of Joey's big projects when the province does join Confederation is also to start a garment manufacturing industry, which goes horribly wrong, but is a very interesting little blip in Newfoundland history, which is the second attempt at garment making in the mid-20th century. I think Terry? Mm. Mm. Yeah. 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 So using different sources to get at the same question, so like a similar question. And like I have a lot of respect for genealogists, obviously, having worked in the Maritime History Archive, we see them at work all the time and they're so dedicated and very professional. And and that type of collaboration could produce really interesting results, especially working with somebody who would be looking at the family or the name side of my data column where I'm more interested in the clothing and because that is something I do want to sit down and do, but I'm kind of less familiar with, would be sitting down and trying to link all these families, trying to figure out who's related to whom, trying to figure out how these families are situated in Bonavista, because there's obviously large families. There's Templemans who are also merchants and later have their own premises that are purchasing from the Ryan store, and like the Ryans are purchasing more expensive stuff. So you don't want to be, and I don't want to be sitting around making suppositions about what ordinary Bonavistans are purchasing when there's clearly people in the records that are living a different lifestyle from like your average fisher family or even your planter family. in in this community. So that is something I have to deal with. But yeah, like Ulrich's work is so inspiring. And I also just recently went back and looked at Anne Smart Martin's book on Sookie's Looking Glass, which her records have that similar per consumer designation where it does tell you who's coming in. And because her work is in the Carolinas, she's able to record when enslaved people are purchasing from her store, which is really interesting. Yeah. So do I have actual goods, any of these actual goods personally or collections of these goods? So the short answer for that is no, and it's largely because I I talk about women in this talk a little bit more, but I actually focus on men's clothes, and men's clothing in specific is was just never a priority for collectors and remains not a priority for both clothing historians and generally for collectors of clothes. Like people aren't rushing out and collecting men's breeches, unfortunately for me. So when I do find, but when I do find them, I try to keep track of where they are. When I was working at the Caird, for example, I used to visit Nelson's clothes a lot, not because I care that much about Nelson, but because he's got a pair of beautiful socks on display. And I'm the weirdo that's like, oh, I don't care about any of this other stuff. I want to come up here and see his socks because who else's socks get saved? No one's. But his got covered in blood when he died. So here they are on display for everyone to see. And there's a really great sailor's suit of clothes in the London Museum that I haven't actually gotten to personally see, but but every time someone tells me they have, I'm super jealous. But it's like the shirt and breeches, and the breeches have been like meticulously repaired to the point where it's like the Argonaut, like how much of the breeches are the original breeches. And then the shirt itself, you can see where the tarred lines from the ship have gone across his chest and they're still stained. It's a 300-year-old shirt. Those stains are never coming out. So yeah, so when you get garments, there's a beautiful pair of slop breeches in the National Maritime Museum. And I was very lucky and was to go into the rooms and look at some of their collection, but again, it's very sparse. So a beautiful pair of like higher than your knee, so like up here, men's boots with wooden soles, and those Stanfield underwear, and a beautiful Guernsey that was hand repaired, clearly multiple times. But again, the first time I went to see it 10 years ago, I asked the curator about clothing, and he showed me the Hooked Rugs collection, because that's where they all are, right? So I think there's a final. Hmm. All right. Yeah, and something I should. All right. Oh, yeah. 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 No, I was really Oh, yeah. So about language and the use of sparrow bills and sparables and the specific, and I didn't want to get into this too deeply, but the actual specific use of the word sparable for when they're used in a shoe is if they're used incorrectly and you're starting to feel them come out in and stab your foot. If and because there's several cards in the Dictionary of Newfoundland English database that specifically point out that if it's nailed in properly, it's not a sparable. It's only when it comes out and starts to dig into your foot that it's a sparable. And so, yeah, but the Munfla word card collection is endlessly fascinating and a little bit frustrating because you can see where the original collectors weren't really that interested in these words for clothes. And so these really iconic words, so like, for example, the cuffs and buskins, because they're constantly pointed out by people who came from away and are describing Newfoundlanders, they get put into the Dictionary of Newfoundland English, but there's a little bit less inquisitiveness about other forms of stuff. And that is a little bit tragic for me, but there is some stuff on like men's clothing, but the real tragedy is that where women's clothes just weren't really described that much, they really suffer in the sense that there's no sense of whether there were like colloquial or specific Newfoundland vocabulary words for anything women were wearing in the home. So it would be, so it's kind of unfortunate for that, but I am trying to use and look at a lot of the cards that never made it into the dictionary or were truncated when they made it into the dictionary because they're fascinating and extremely valuable, especially when it's people who passed away in the 60s and 70s and had reminiscences from the late 19th century as children.
On that note, I'd like to both thank our audience for their online participation, for our in-person audience as well, and just offer one last round of applause and thank you for Megan for giving us this.
Thank you.
So once again, thank you all for coming out. We'll be back on the last Thursday in October with a lovely talk about the history of teaching in the outports. So stay tuned for your email. And once again, thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks.
It's 9.
Thank you. Marvelous.